Welcome to the deep dive. Get ready, because today we are taking a serious plunge into some really radical, mind-bending ideas about reality, consciousness, perception, stuff you might not have encountered quite like this before.
Yeah, definitely.
We're diving deep into the Synergistic Theory. It's this incredibly ambitious framework developed over 15 years by Jacobo Grinberg-Zylberbaum, a brilliant, somewhat enigmatic Mexican researcher.
And for this deep dive, our source material is, it's straight from the horse's mouth, you could say, excerpts from Grinberg's own big text, The Synergistic Theory.
Right.
It's dense, no doubt about it, but wow, it is packed with some really profound insights if you take the time to unpack it.
Absolutely. So think of us today as like your guides through this incredible intellectual landscape. We're here to unpack Grinberg's core idea, this notion that the brain doesn't just, passively get reality fed to it, but that it actively transforms some kind of fundamental structure into the world we experience.
Exactly.
And we're really going to try and explore every single dimension, every detail from these source materials to really get the full scope of his research, where it all leads.
Okay, so let's unpack this theory right from the beginning. As you said, Jacobo Grinberg spent 15 years, like intense years, working on this.
Yeah.
And he needed a word, a term for the fundamental force or process at the heart of it all. So he coined synergy.
Synergy.
Yeah, it's a neologism he made up from synthesis and energy.
Synthesis and energy. Synergy.
Yeah.
Okay, it sounds like bringing things together, but with like a force behind it.
That's a good way to put it.
So what was the big question, the thing that drove him to build this whole framework?
The absolute core question, the mystery that really, really got him was this. How does brain activity actually become sensory experience?
Right.
How does something purely physical, electrical impulses, neurons firing, how does that somehow give rise to the subjective feeling of seeing red or hearing a song?
Yeah, the experience itself.
Exactly. A percept, like redness. It's just qualitatively completely different from neural activity, that leap, from the physical process to the subjective experience. That was the puzzle he wanted to solve.
That is the fundamental mystery of consciousness, isn't it? And the sources show he wasn't just like looking under the neuroscience rock. He cast an incredibly wide net.
Oh, totally. His approach was deeply, almost like dizzyingly interdisciplinary. He was pulling from cutting-edge stuff in quantum mechanics, the real nuts and bolts of psychophysiology,
Okay.
and then synthesizing that with deep wisdom from all sorts of mystical traditions, Jewish Kabbalah, Christian mysticism, Buddhist philosophy, Hindu yoga practices.
Wow.
And this is crucial, the direct lived experiences reported by Mexican shamans he worked with.
And it wasn't just like academic curiosity about these, was it? He saw them as different ways of pointing at the same underlying truth.
Precisely. He actually called this process, this bringing together of seemingly really different, sometimes even contradictory areas of knowledge. He called it a game of glass beads.
A game of glass beads.
Yeah, like Hermann Hesse's novel, a kind of playful, joyful synthesis,
Yeah.
bringing all these diverse perspectives together to get right down to the roots of how we actually construct the reality we perceive.
Okay, so where does this journey into reality actually start, according to his theory? It's not with, the solid objects we see around us.
Not at all. To our everyday senses, space itself just looks empty.
Invisible.
Right. Totally without structure. It just is.
Yeah, it's the background, the void between the things. But the theory says that apparent emptiness, that's just our perception, like a limitation of our brain.
Exactly. It's like, imagine a mind that's not really trained to grasp a super complex, abstract idea.
Yeah.
It just feels overwhelming, maybe even empty or formless to that mind.
Okay.
Or trying to understand someone else's incredibly profound, mystical experience if you've never had anything even remotely like it. Just doesn't compute. Space feels empty to us, Grinberg argues, because our built-in decoding ability isn't turned up high enough, by lack of a better phrase.
So what makes him think there is this hidden structure then? What's the evidence or the logic behind it?
It comes from a really simple observation about how we perceive things. You can decode a visual image, something with tons of information, from just a tiny, tiny bit of space.
Like looking at something far away.
Exactly. Think about a telescope. It collects light that interacts with its mirror, right? It amplifies that information.
Yeah.
And it shows you that information about objects, billions, literally billions of miles away, is present everywhere in the space that light traveled through to reach you. You can point that telescope at countless different distant objects, all from that single point where the light enters it. which strongly suggests that that single point in space must somehow hold information about all of them.
Wow, okay. So the deduction is each point in space must contain the total information of all other points in the universe.
That is the leap.
And for that to even be possible, there has to be some kind of fundamental structure with a colossal capacity to hold all that information.
Exactly. And Grinberg notes that quantum mechanics actually uses the term lattice for this kind of fundamental structure. Its capacity to hold the entire universe's information at every single point is, well, immense.
The lattice.
Yeah. He also mentions the Guarani Indians. Apparently, they express a similar idea in their textile writing. They weave ideas into fabrics, and they incise threads of other fabric at each point of their main space fabric. It's a powerful metaphor for a structure where information is just interwoven everywhere.
Okay, so how does this lattice structure manage to hold so much information? What are its key features?
Well, according to the theory, its capacity really depends on two main things. Its vibrational capability and the number of dimensions it includes.
Vibrations and dimensions.
Right. A structure that can vibrate at potentially infinite frequencies at each point could encode just vast amounts of information. And just like a 3D object holds way more information than a flat 2D plane, the lattice must include a huge number, maybe even an infinite number, of dimensions.
Okay, so we're talking about a colossal, multi-dimensional matrix with infinite vibrational capacity, where information from the entire universe converges at any single point. Okay, that's already a pretty big concept to wrap your head around.
And here's where it gets really interesting and really pushes against, standard physics.
Yeah.
Another characteristic they deduced is that when even a small portion of this lattice is modified or disturbed in any way,
Yeah.
it affects every single other point in the entire space. Instantly.
Instantly.
Whoa. He uses analogies like watching a supernova explode. If you had a powerful enough instrument, you could see it from anywhere in the universe, right? Or even just an insect flying in principle. Its flight could be observed from any point in the area where it's flying. Any local change has to have a global effect.
That suggests an incredible level of interconnectedness, not like separate objects just bumping into each other.
Precisely. It suggests the lattice has a structure kind of like a superconductor. Complete fluidity, instantaneous interaction between all its parts. And, crucially, it's non-empty. Throughout its entire extent, there are no gaps, no areas of absence. Like when you walk around, you don't suddenly hit a spot where your perception of the world just vanishes.
Right. Yeah, we perceive a continuous reality. So, okay, the lattice is this multidimensional, superconducting matrix, no gaps, huge vibrational capacity, total info convergence at every point. And the information can be decoded as a continuum.
Right. Like when we move, images blur and merge together. That sense of perceptual continuity, he calls it the reality glue our brain provides.
Reality glue, I like that.
Yeah. He sees that as reflecting a fundamental informational continuity that's already in the lattice itself.
And he takes it even further, doesn't he? He says our own thoughts and emotions affect this lattice too.
Yes. As a fascinating extension. He posits that our internal states, our thoughts, our feelings, they aren't just stuck inside our heads. They're also distortions of this exact same fundamental structure. Just like a big object or a tiny particle is a distortion.
So my mood is rippling through space.
In a way, yeah. And the temporal permanence of these distortions, whether a thought is fleeting or an emotion lingers, that depends on things like how often it recurs and whether it kind of aligns with a natural, inherent way the lattice is already organized, its own modes.
Okay, so if everything is a distortion, there must be different kinds or states of the lattice itself.
Exactly. The theory contrasts different states. On one hand, you could have a perfectly homogeneous, perfectly coherent lattice, no distortions at all.
What would that be like?
If we could perceive it directly, it would seem invisible, totally devoid of objects. And, interestingly, devoid of gravitational force. Because gravity indicates curvatures in space, distortions. So that's one pole, pure coherence.
And the other pole?
That's a region with local distortions. That's where we perceive, where we detect gravity, meaning space is curved there. This disordered state of the lattice has lower coherence.
How do we actually sense this difference in coherence, can we?
He uses the relative motion effect as an example. You know when you're in a moving car. Distant things, like the moon or mountains far away, they seem relatively fixed. Right? They don't seem to zoom past like things closer up.
Right, yeah.
He explains this by saying their information is represented more coherently in the space we're interacting with. Whereas near objects like the road lines or trees right by the road, They change position really fast because their informational representation in that space is less coherent. Each point in the space near them contains a different organization of information relative to our movement.
Ah, so our nervous system is actually picking up on these coherence differences, and we experience that as like sensing speed, acceleration, things coming closer or moving away.
Yes, and this difference in coherence is directly tied to informational convergence. In a zone of maximum coherence, no distortions, each point has the total information, and it's all distributed coherently because the convergence is maximal. Near distortions, though, the angles of convergence change, which decreases the similarity between points and lowers the coherence.
Okay, and this idea of coherence brings us back to that word he coined, synergy.
Right. Within the lattice itself, zones with greater coherence, higher information density, maximum convergence, those are high synergy zones. Zones with less coherence are low synergy zones.
So high synergy is like the pure coherent state.
Exactly. The highest synergy pole of the lattice has maximum coherence, information density, convergence, homogeneity. That's the state without gravity or discrete objects, because gravity and matter are linked to the distortions, the lower synergy states.
And the low synergy pole is matter.
That's what we perceive as solid matter, which implies that, say, an electron or a proton, any elementary particle, it isn't some fundamentally separate little thing.
Yeah.
It comes into being when the basic lattice structure undergoes specific modifications, specific distortions.
Okay.
This, he argues, is what explains wave-particle duality in physics. A particle looks like an independent object, but fundamentally it's just a modified part of the same underlying continuous structure.
That sounds, well, it sounds a lot like some ideas from mystical traditions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It resonates really strongly with the Buddhist concept of sunyata.
Emptiness.
Often translated as emptiness, yeah, but not emptiness like nothingness. It's emptiness meaning that objects lack any absolute independent existence. They're seen as part of this interdependent matrix, just arising from modifications of the fundamental structure. Everything is interconnected, intertwined.
So the lattice is like this fundamental emptiness that can take on any form.
Viewed that way, yes.
Yeah.
It has the potential for infinite forms, colossal plasticity, can take on any configuration.
Now, even though the lattice seems continuous, the theory also talks about discrete bands of organization within it. What's that about?
It suggests that while the underlying structure is continuous, the types of distortions and the ways they organize themselves fall into distinct categories, like families of distortions. He compares it to quantum layers in physics.
Okay.
And the sources specifically mention the four fundamental physical forces we know from physics: gravitational, weak interaction, strong interaction, and electromagnetic.
The forces governing the universe.
Yeah. These are seen in this theory as families of fundamental distortions within the lattice.
So the forces are distortions.
Yes. These forces, or the fields associated with them, are what Grinberg calls synergic bands. And this is where it gets absolutely critical for understanding consciousness.
Well, so.
Because considering these synergic bands is essential for understanding the existence of discrete levels of consciousness. According to the theory, each distinct level of consciousness is associated with a specific synergic band.
Wait, so the fundamental forces
Hmm.
are also levels of consciousness, manifesting in space. That's truly radical.
It completely flips the usual script, doesn't it? Especially in traditional Western thought, which tends to confuse the end product, what we perceive, with the origin.
Yeah, we think there's an out there totally separate from our in here.
Right. But the theory posits that we actively participate in creating our perceived reality through how we interact with this lattice. Reality itself is one unified field, but our consciousness sort of divides it up, filters it into distinct experiences. And that filtering depends on our level of consciousness, our decoding capacity, not on fundamental divisions in reality itself. Ken Wilber talks about similar ideas too, about levels of reality construction.
So what we perceive isn't the full, raw reality. It's a limited, filtered version that we construct by interacting with the lattice.
That's the core idea.
Yeah.
We only get access to the final product of our brain's processing, and we mistake that product for the whole reality. Remember, all the universe's information is concentrated at any single point in space.
Right.
But we only decode a tiny fraction of it to build our percepts. What we perceive is fundamentally a limited human creation. And the qualities we attribute to reality, like light and sound as we actually experience them, they don't exist like that in the raw, undistorted lattice.
So the lattice point doesn't contain, like, the color red or the shape of a tree.
Not in the way we see them, no. It's more like a complex set of energetic morphologies, a pattern of potential information. We decode these patterns using our brain structure. And it's the interaction between our brain's characteristics and the lattice's characteristics that results in the subjective qualities we experience, the redness, the sound of a bell.
So the lattice point holds the raw data algorithmically, but our brain adds the structure and the subjective feel.
You can put it that way, yeah. The lattice point holds all the image details, but in an algorithmic form. Our brain's decoding process adds the structure, the organization, and crucially, the subjective quality.
And presumably, the lattice point holds way more information, way more decoding possibilities than any single human brain can possibly handle.
Oh, orders and orders of magnitude more. The decoding capacity we have depends entirely on our neuronal function, which in turn is determined by and also determines our level of consciousness.
So in this view, our level of consciousness literally determines the reality we perceive and interact with.
Directly, yes.
And this decoding process, it's not just random or chaotic, is it?
No, not at all. The theory argues that the very organization of the human brain is actually a detailed model of the lattice. Maybe not a perfectly identical one yet, but a model nonetheless.
The brain models the structure of space.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
True. Direct perception of reality as it is, without filtering, would depend on reaching a state of unity consciousness, where the whole observer-observed distinction just dissolves.
Okay.
And importantly, the theory emphasizes that even the lattice itself isn't the ultimate reality. There's something else, the observer, that seems to exist outside the lattice and all its subsequent structures, like the hyperfields we'll get into later.
Fascinating. Okay, so the brain evolves to mirror this fundamental structure of space. Let's dive into that.
Right. So moving from the abstract lattice, the theory looks at how the brain, this incredibly complex biological thing, evolved. It suggests that after millions, maybe billions of years of evolutionary trial and error, the current human brain seems to have developed as a mechanism specifically designed to experience and decode as many of these synergic bands, these fundamental force consciousness levels, as possible.
It almost sounds like the lattice was trying to build something that could understand itself.
Almost, yeah. The solution that evolution came up with over vast timescales was to create a neural mechanism that could mimic the fundamental sort of superconducting structure of the lattice.
Wow.
It's even posited that the brain emerged from the lattice itself, as if the lattice, in its kind of absolute unity, wanted a model of itself, maybe to reflect upon itself, maybe to resolve its infinite loneliness, as the text puts it poetically, or maybe just to experience itself in a localized individual way.
That is a poetic idea. And it had to mimic the lattice's capacity for uniqueness.
Yes. Grinberg notes the Celtal word for education in some Mexican indigenous traditions, Peye wo tes NDL. Apparently literally translates to make another become unique, which suggests that the deep wisdom in these cultures might have intuited this idea that the highest form of development is somehow mirroring the fundamental uniqueness and unity of creation itself.
And physiologically, how did biology pull this off? How did it create this mimic?
The process involved creating biological superconductors, the neuron and its axon.
Okay.
These cells are capable of transmitting information without loss and concentrating huge amounts of information. Each neuron gets thousands of inputs via its dendrites. It concentrates that information and then sends coded signals down the axon using the superconducting-like mechanism.
Right.
And then these neurons interconnect, integrating information into new codes, which get transmitted and interconnected even further up the chain.
And early brains presumably weren't very good mimics.
No, not at all. Early brains had relatively few neurons. They were poor copies of the lattice. The lattice's constant fundamental structure acted like the reference point, the blueprint for their development. He notes that Tibetan wisdom traditions also seem to have a similar idea about consciousness, mirroring the structure of reality.
You mentioned distortions. Is there like a force pushing back against them, trying to keep the lattice pure?
Yes, exactly. The theory describes a colossal repulsive force coming from the basic, undistorted lattice state, pushing any distortions back towards their origin, back towards dissolution.
Okay.
But there's an equally powerful opposing force driving distortions to join together, to increase their complexity, and by doing so, elevate their synergic level.
A kind of creative tension.
A dynamic tension, yes. And the result of this push and pull over eons was the human brain. With its, now, the text here specifically states 12 million neurons.
12 million. That sounds really low compared to what we usually hear today, you know, billions.
Yes, you're right. Modern estimates are much higher, in the tens of billions. But the text we're drawing from, Grinberg's work here, uses the figure of 12 million in this specific context. It's discussing the scale of interconnection needed to resolve that fundamental tension between the repulsive force wanting dissolution and the attractive force driving complexity.
Okay.
The point being made is that a structure of that immense interconnectivity, and he emphasizes the combinatorial possibilities, are astronomical, similar in number to the elementary particles in the universe, was needed to achieve a return to the origin, but not through simple disintegration.
So sticking to the source, 12 million neurons with that incredible interconnection capacity.
Yes, that's the number used here. And this complexity, he argues, allows for resolving that mystery of returning to the origin, but by creating oneself on equal terms with the creator, capable of mirroring the whole. This return allows us to consciously experience, as total individuals, not just basic forces like raw emotion or pain, but all the infinitely subtle nuances of sensory experience, mental activity, spiritual feelings. He urges us not to refuse to flow in this richness of experience, seeing that refusal as a kind of betrayal of the immense evolutionary effort that went into creating this capacity.
And the brain mimics the lattice specifically through these circuits and how they process information.
Precisely. These circuits decode the synergic bands, those fundamental force consciousness levels in the lattice, using a process he calls neuroalgorithmization.
Neuroalgorithmization, okay. But what about the subjective quality of experience? Seeing the redness, hearing the music, where does that come from?
That's where the neural field enters the picture. It's described as a different brain mechanism, one for direct analog interaction with the lattice.
Analog versus digital.
Kind of. Think of neuroalgorithmization as the brain's digital processing side. It's for thinking, conceptualizing, using language, breaking things down into discrete codes and patterns. The neural field is the analog side. It's for direct experiencing, for feeling, for sensing the qualitative richness of reality. Neuroalgorithmization is presented as an internal unifying mechanism working within the cellular structure. The neural field unifies brain activity out in the energetic dimension of the lattice itself.
Can you give us an example of this neuroalgorithmic decoding, like how we see something?
Absolutely. The source uses the retina as a prime example. The human retina is presented as a lattice decoding mechanism. It's got apparently over 300 million receptors.
Wow.
That transform the photon electromagnetic fields arriving from the lattice into electrical potentials. Then it has at least 3 layers of cells designed specifically for neural algorithmization, processing that raw input. And this eventually leads to about 1 million output axons forming the optic nerve.
So it's translating a slice of the lattice's energetic information into brain signals.
Exactly. It transforms a small portion of the lattice's information into 1 million two-dimensional electrical channels that travel into the brain. Each axon in that optic nerve concentrates information gathered from hundreds of retinal receptors, converging it first onto bipolar cells, then onto ganglion cells.
And the code is electrical pulses.
Yes, the code at this stage is discrete electrical pulses forming complex temporal patterns. 1 million of these patterns running in parallel form the initial neural algorithm representing the lattice information coming from the visual field.
And this convergence process, concentrating info from many receptors on a fewer axons, that mirrors the lattice.
Exactly. That convergence neural algorithmization, concentrating information from a vast cellular area in the retina onto a much smaller population of neurons in the optic nerve, it mirrors how a single lattice point concentrates information from the rest of the entire lattice.
Okay.
And then this code and retinal information gets further decoded and processed in brain structures like the thalamus and, of course, the cerebral cortex.
And the convergence continues deeper in the brain.
Yes. In the cortex, you see continued convergent processing, but it's also combined with divergent processing, spreading information out as well.
Yeah.
High-power neural algorithmic codes, though, are key here. They concentrate information from potentially billions of neurons into relatively restricted populations, again mimicking that lattice convergence principle.
Okay.
And then these high-level visual codes interact with codes from auditory systems, touch, other senses, activating second and third-order neural algorithms in what are called polysensory cortices. These areas concentrate information from multiple senses together.
So there's a kind of hierarchy. Information processing gets more concentrated, more abstract as you go deeper.
Precisely. He describes a brain neurosynthetic continuum, which sounds very similar to the coherence levels we talked about in the lattice itself.
Neurosynthetic continuum.
Yeah. The low pole of this continuum is near the sensory receptors, it's less coherent, has minimal convergence, deals with very concrete, raw sensory processes. The high pole is up in those high-level polysensory structures. It's much more coherent, shows greater convergence, and it's associated with abstract thinking, conceptualization, language.
And this high end, this high neurosynergy pole, is that his term for brain level synergy? Is it similar to high synergy in the lattice?
Yes, neurosynergia seems to be the term he uses for that brain-level synergy or coherence. And yes, the high neurosynergia pole is characterized by greater information density, it vibrates at a higher frequency, it's more coherent, and it involves greater convergence.
Okay.
It also incorporates more dimensions simply because it's polysensory. It's combining information from multiple sensory modalities, unlike the unisensory low poles, which are just dealing with, say, vision or just hearing.
Does this level of processing affect our experience of time at all?
It absolutely does. A high neurosynergy neural algorithm inherently involves a longer processing time in the brain. But this doesn't necessarily slow things down subjectively. Instead, it expands the duration of the present moment experienced for that particular process.
Expand the present.
Yeah. It means a high neurosynergia code includes and concentrates events from different temporal orders, all within that expanded present. The complexity of a brain function, like abstract thought, correlates directly to its neurosynthetic level. It requires high information density and these powerful time-extending neural algorithms.
It really sounds like the brain's structure and function deeply parallel the lattice structure in multiple ways.
The similarity between the lattice structure and the brain's organization is described as quite remarkable in the theory. And it's observed across the same conditions we analyzed for the lattice characteristics earlier. He actually lists specific points of similarity drawn directly from the source material.
Okay, let's hear them.
Number 1, informational convergence. We saw how lattice points converge total info. The brain's convergence starts right at the receptors and becomes really prominent in those high neuroalgorithmic polysensory regions.
Right, concentrating info from many points down to fewer.
Got it.
Number 2, modification affects all parts. A change in one part of the lattice affects every point. Brain studies seem to back this up for the brain, too. There was an experiment by Schwartz and Ramos with cats.
Yeah?
They showed that training modified single-cell firing patterns in one specific brain area, but those modifications correlated with changes across different distant brain areas, too. And E. Roy John's experiments further supported this idea. A modification in one part of the brain seems to ripple through and affect all the others.
So a change in one neuron isn't just local, it affects the whole network. That's the implication. Number 3, coherence and relative motion. The lattice has these coherence levels and the related relative motion effects we discussed. Brain neuroalgorithmic processes show something similar. If you modify the information coming into the retina, it causes greater variation in the codes of lower-level cells like the bipolars, less variation in the ganglion cells, and minimal changes in those high-level, inclusive polysensory cortical codes. Those higher-level codes stay relatively constant, even with variations in the initial sensory input. A bit like how distant objects appear fixed when you're moving. Grinberg-Zylberbaum and E.R. John apparently demonstrated this experimentally back in 1981.
So the high-level processing is more stable, more coherent. Maybe that relates to our sense of a consistent reality or even a consistent self.
That's exactly the idea proposed. These high-powered neural algorithmization levels in the brain could be associated with consistent ego functions, much like the coherent representation of distant objects in the lattice.
Okay, what's next?
Number 4, no discontinuities. The lattice has no empty areas, no gaps. Similarly, a living brain is characterized by continuous neuronal activity at all times. Even during deep sleep or deep meditation, there's always background activity. No discontinuities, no moments of complete neuronal emptiness.
Constant activity mirrors the non-empty structure of space. Makes sense.
Number 5, colossal plasticity. The lattice can activate theoretically infinite types of distortions. The brain shows a similar amazing capacity for modification and plasticity. You see it vividly in dream images, in creativity, in memory recall.
Right.
Think about the process of just remembering a visual image from the past based only on someone saying a word. That involves a complex chain. Sound transduction, language processing, memory retrieval, visual cortex activation, synthesis of the image. It shows the brain's capacity for almost infinite internal representations, similar perhaps to the lattice's capacity for distortion.
So our internal world is potentially as varied and plastic as reality itself.
Potentially, yes. Number 6, temporal duration permanence. Lattice distortions can have different durations. Brain memory patterns also show varying temporal durations. Iconic memory is super brief. Short-term lasts longer. Long-term memory can last a lifetime. Similar to the lattice, the duration of a brain pattern seems associated with things like how often it recurs, how natural or meaningful it is.
Okay.
Number 7, levels of coherence. The lattice has different coherence levels, different degrees of synergy. The brain does too. Brain coherence is often measured by looking at the similarity of electrical patterns, like EEG, across different brain areas. Higher similarity means greater coherence.
Like how synchronized different parts are.
Exactly. An interhemispheric coherence between the two brain hemispheres is often seen as a measure of how unified the brain's function is. Grinberg's own lab studies, cited from 1981, apparently found that increases in interhemispheric coherence correlated significantly with subjective reports of increased internal unification and states of internal silence or stillness.
Linking the brain state directly to the subjective experience again. Very cool.
And importantly, high interhemispheric coherence, indicating high neurosynergia in the brain, seems to correspond directly to those higher synergy levels of the lattice, the ones devoid of distortions, objects, and gravity. A state that could be described as a kind of fundamental silence or absolute coherence in space itself.
Wow. Okay, 2 more points of similarity.
Right. Number 8, absence of isomorphisms. Remember how the information at a lattice point doesn't physically resemble the distortions it represents? Same the brain. The output from the optic nerve is just a digital code, electrical pulses. It has absolutely no physical resemblance to the visual image it will eventually help create, nor to the underlying lattice energetic organization that stimulated the retina in the first place.
Right. The code isn't the picture. The map isn't the territory.
Exactly. And finally, number 9, discrete bands. The lattice has these syntergic bands, fundamental force consciousness levels, that are internally continuous but discrete from each other. The brain also seems to operate in distinct bands. Sensory bands, touch, hearing, sight are distinct qualities, and bands of consciousness like wakefulness, different sleep stages, meditative states. These brain bands share that same property. They feel internally continuous, but they are distinctly different from each other.
And these brain bands, do they link back to the processing time differences we talked about earlier?
Yes, precisely. These bands correspond to different levels of neuroalgorithmization and distinct degrees of neurosyntergia. The auditory band of consciousness, for example, the brain state needed to process an experience, sound activates after about 20 to 30 milliseconds of brain processing.
Okay.
The visual band requires a minimum of 50 milliseconds of processing to emerge. And the conceptual band, the state needed for abstract thought and language comprehension, requires more than 150 milliseconds. These are distinctly different processing time bands.
Okay, so the brain as a whole, it's not just mimicking the lattice in its structure and processing. Its complex activity is also creating a major distortion in the lattice itself, isn't it?
That's the next crucial step in the theory. Yes. All that brain activity, dendritic micropotentials, action potentials firing, these are all considered microdistortions of the lattice. Now, combine the activity of, again using the source's number, 12 million neurons, all those moving ions, the extracellular electrical fields, and especially the interaction of all those microdistortions, particularly those incorporating the super high-density codes from the high-powered neural algorithmic populations.
Yeah.
This generates what the theory calls a truly hyper-complex macro distortion of the lattice. And this macro distortion is what the theory terms the neural field.
The neural field. So it's like the brain's collective energetic footprint on the fabric of space.
That's a great way to put it, yes. And it's presented as the analog mechanism for unifying all that incredibly diverse brain activity. Remember the distinction. Neural algorithmization unifies internally within the cellular dimension using digital-like codes. The neural field unifies brain activity out in the energetic dimension of the lattice itself.
How can we even begin to visualize the complexity of this neural field? It sounds almost impossible.
It is almost impossibly complex to picture fully. Think about it. Each neuron is a 3D structure, getting thousands of inputs. Its membrane potential is constantly oscillating in incredibly complex 3D patterns based on all that input, creating microdistortions of the lattice. Now multiply that by 12 million active neurons, and in the ionic flows, the surrounding extracellular fields, the dynamic interaction of all these microdistortions, especially those driven by the most complex neural algorithms, it's staggering.
Okay, so maybe we focus on its global characteristics. What are the overall features of this neural field?
We can definitely outline some global characteristics based on the theory. First, the neural field varies in its overall coherence. That means the morphological similarity, the structural likeness of its energetic patterns across different areas can change.
Okay.
Second, it has a continuum of possible frequencies it can operate at. And higher information density being processed in the brain corresponds to a higher frequency in the neural field.
Higher frequency, higher info density.
Right. And fundamentally, higher coherence and higher frequency in the neural field equate to greater synergy in the field itself.
So a highly coherent, high-frequency neural field is a high synergy neural field. Like the brain is operating in a very unified, high-energy state.
Exactly. And there's a crucial reciprocal interaction here. A higher synergy neural field actively increases the synergy of the lattice in its vicinity. And conversely, if the brain interacts with a high synergy zone of the lattice, that can elevate the neural field's synergy.
It's a two-way street.
Yes. And the 3D geometry of the brain's active circuits is directly reflected in the neural field's energetic morphology, its shape, out in the lattice. So a variation in the brain's energetic patterns affects the entire lattice structure because of that fundamental interconnectedness we talked about.
Can these patterns in the neural field become like permanent fixtures in the lattice? Can they leave a lasting imprint?
The theory suggests yes, they can. A sustained recurrence of a specific neural field pattern, thinking the same thought repeatedly, holding the same emotion, can cause more or less permanent alterations in the lattice structure itself.
Really?
How permanent depends on how congruent that specific pattern is with the natural inherent aspects or modes of organization that already exist within the lattice.
Congruent, like how well it fits with the lattice's own nature.
Exactly. These congruent interaction areas, where the neural field pattern aligns well with the lattice, are referred to as permitted orbitals of consciousness. Bands or patterns that are incongruent, that don't align with the lattice's fundamental nature, are non-permitted orbitals. They might not last as long or have the same effect.
What about a neural field operating at its absolute maximum synergy? What would that state be like?
A maximal synergy neural field, one with absolute coherence, the highest possible frequency, is described as being much more similar to the basic undistorted lattice state. Remember, that's the lattice's highest synergy pole, the state free of distortions, gravity, and discrete objects. Pure potential, you could say.
Okay.
A low synergy neural field, on the other hand, is energetically closer to the low synergy lattice pole, the pole associated with what we perceive as matter.
So achieving a state of higher neural field synergy allows for a fundamentally different kind of interaction with reality, with the basic lattice.
Yes, that's the idea. Higher neural field synergy allows for a more congruent, more direct interaction with the pure, fundamental lattice state itself.
And it's not just about individual neural fields interacting with the lattice, is it? What about interactions between brains?
Right. Different neural fields from different brains can and do interact. They create inter-brain interference patterns. Grinberg-Zylberbaum and Ramos' experiments, published in the International Journal of Neuroscience in 81 and 87, apparently demonstrated this experimentally. They found correlations between the brain activity of separated individuals under certain conditions.
Wow.
The lattice structure that incorporates all these individual neural fields and their collective interference patterns is given another name, the hyperfield.
The hyperfield. That sounds almost like a collective consciousness field.
That's essentially what it's described as. The hyperfield includes all the individual neural fields and their combined interference patterns. It's like a planetary neuronal field influenced by collective human organization, cultures, cities, countries, and this collective field structure is represented throughout the lattice.
Does it include non-humans too?
He also mentions the expanded hyperfield, which specifically includes the neural fields generated by non-human brains as well.
Okay, so there's the lattice, individual neural fields distorting it, and collective hyperfields representing group consciousness patterns. And our ability to perceive any of this depends on our own brain's capacity.
Exactly. Decoding the lattice, the hyperfield, the expanded hyperfield, it all depends on a specific brain's neuroalgorithmic capacity and the synergy level of its neural field. If the synergy of a particular organization, whether it's a synergic band in the lattice or a complex pattern in the hyperfield, exceeds a brain's current capacity, it simply isn't perceived by that brain. You only decode and perceive what falls within your capacity.
So our perception is literally limited by our brain's current state and abilities.
Yes. And according to the theory, that neural algorithmization capacity is often limited by what Grinberg calls coding errors.
Coding errors, like bugs in the software.
Sort of. These could be genetic, developmental, or acquired limitations, things that prevent the brain from processing information optimally or accessing higher levels of coherence. A brain theoretically free of these errors could decode many more synergic bands, perceive much more of reality.
Which brings us to consciousness development practices.
Exactly. This is where practices like meditation, certain types of psychotherapy, maybe even shamanic techniques fit into the framework. They are seen as methods to potentially increase the brain's neural algorithmization capacity, correct those coding errors, and, crucially, elevate the overall synergy level of the neural field.
So developing your consciousness means literally changing your brain's capacity to interact with the fundamental fabric of reality,
Yeah.
enhancing its ability to generate a higher Syntergic neural field.
That's the postulate, yes. Elevating neural field synergy expands your consciousness, allows you, the individual, to incorporate more synergic bands into your perceived reality, and brings your individual consciousness closer to that state of unity consciousness, the state of complete congruent interaction with the pure, undistorted lattice.
This really brings us to the absolute heart of experience itself. And it directly challenges that historical paradox, that mind-body problem that Western thought has wrestled with for so long.
That's right. The traditional approach, assigning matter the primary role, assuming the physical world is the fundamental reality and that consciousness somehow just pops out of it. That approach has made understanding subjective experience incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
Yeah.
The Synergistic Theory proposes flipping that assumption entirely. Consciousness, not matter, is the starting point.
Consciousness as the absolute foundation.
Yes. From this perspective, consciousness isn't something the brain produces. It's seen as a fundamental, unique attribute of the lattice itself, and therefore also an attribute of all its distortions, including individual neural fields and the collective hyperfields.
So the synergic bands we talked about, the fundamental forces, they're actually orbitals of consciousness.
Exactly. They are the true orbitals of consciousness, distinct levels or forms that the one consciousness can take as it manifests through the lattice structure.
And what are the different forms or levels of this consciousness?
Consciousness exists across all the synergic levels the lattice can possibly assume, from the most fundamental, pure state to the most complex distortions like matter or neural fields. The quality of that consciousness depends on the complexity, coherence, and information density of that particular level or band.
So pure consciousness is...
Pure consciousness is the basic, undistorted lattice state itself, a state of absolute unity, infinite potential, perfect coherence. Human consciousness, as we typically experience it, is represented by the hyperfield and its associated bands, encompassing the collective activity of human brains and giving rise to all our specific attributes, our sensory experiences, our thoughts, emotions, self-awareness, and so on.
Okay, so how do we get the specific qualities of experience, like seeing versus hearing, from this framework? They feel so different.
Human auditory consciousness, the experience of hearing, arises, according to the theory, when the lattice is distorted by a neural field generated by a brain with, again, using the text-specific number here, 12 billion elements actively engaged in processing auditory information.
12 billion, that's different from the 12 million earlier.
Ah, good catch. Yes, the text uses 12 million when discussing the basic neuronal structure needed for complexity, but then uses 12 billion elements here when discussing the scale required for specific qualities like auditory consciousness. We have to stick to the numbers as presented in the source for each specific point, even if they seem inconsistent.
Okay, noted. 12 billion elements for auditory consciousness.
Yes, 12 billion elements actively processing, and a density of interactions requiring about 20 to 30 milliseconds of processing time. That specific neural field configuration, interacting congruently with the auditory synergic band in the lattice, is auditory experience.
And vision.
Visual consciousness appears when a neural field resulting from a minimum of 50 milliseconds of dedicated visual processing interacts congruently with the visual synergic band.
So the number of brain elements involved and the processing time are crucial for the quality of consciousness experienced.
Yes, according to the source. And it's not just the number of elements and the timing. The specific 3D geometry of the brain structure that's activated also plays a key role in differentiating sensory qualities. Activity primarily in the occipital cortex is linked to visual experience, activity in the temporal cortex to auditory experience, and so on. The location matters.
Okay.
So ultimately, experience itself is the resulting interference pattern that emerges from a congruent interaction between a specific neural field with its particular morphology, frequency, coherence, its synergy level,
Right.
and a similarly structured synergetic organization within a specific lattice band, a synergic band.
So visual field plus visual band, visual reality. Auditory field plus auditory band equals auditory reality.
In essence, yes. And they are qualitatively different because the underlying neural fields and the synergic bands they interact with are structurally and energetically different, leading to different interference patterns.
It sounds incredibly theoretical, almost mathematical, but you stressed earlier that these qualities are only truly known through direct experience.
That's a really crucial point Grinberg makes. You can only know the qualities of consciousness, what it actually feels like, to see red, or hear a bell, or feel love, through direct first-person experience. Realizing the existence of these qualities and the potential for other qualities beyond our usual senses requires proper neuroalgorithmization. The brain needs to have the capacity to process them and recognize them.
Right.
A purely theoretical explanation of the energetic components, the frequencies, the coherence levels, it's just not enough. It's like trying to explain the experience of light to someone born blind or the experience of music to someone born deaf. The map is not the territory.
And are these qualities linked to evolution? Did they appear in a certain order?
Yes. The theory posits that the qualities of consciousness appear on an evolutionary axis. Tactile qualities likely appeared in organisms long before auditory ones, and auditory generally before complex visual ones. Why? Because less evolved organisms with simpler brains couldn't generate neural fields with sufficient synergy, or the right complex morphology, needed for congruent interaction with the more complex auditory or visual synergic bands.
So nature needed bigger, more complex brains.
Exactly, to create neural fields with enough complexity and synergy to interact congruently with these more complex orbitals of consciousness, the synergic bands, and thus activate those specific sensory qualities in the organism's experience.
And the fact that each quality requires a longer processing time, visual taking longer than auditory.
That results in an increase in the subjective duration of the present moment associated with that quality. A visual image requiring 50 milliseconds of processing has a subjectively longer present moment attached to it than a sound requiring only 20 or 30 milliseconds.
A longer
Yeah. And this expansion in the duration of the present, which is correlated with an increase in synergy, both in the neural field and the axis lattice band, allows for the unification of events from different temporal orders, all within a seemingly timeless present moment.
So higher consciousness means a longer now.
Effectively, yes. And the ultimate state, total unification in unity consciousness, would theoretically mean perceiving past, present, and future simultaneously, all within a single timeless present.
Wow. This sounds like it leads almost to a kind of directive or a goal for personal development.
It absolutely does. It ties directly into what Grinberg, perhaps somewhat playfully, refers to as the first commandment of the new age, according to this theory.
Which is?
You will experience and decode as many synergistic bands as possible.
Okay. So expand your perceptual reality. And what's the path to doing that? How do you follow that commandment?
The source points to practices like Mexican shamanism and specific techniques like self-illusional meditation as methods designed to actualize this. These practices aim to increase the brain's capacity to observe, simultaneously, an ever-increasing number of experiences across different areas of consciousness, body, thoughts, emotions, environment, all at once.
Earlier, we talked about how the code in the optic nerves isn't the image itself. Does the neural field somehow contain the actual image details before we experience them?
That's a key point. The sources mention Karl Pribram, another researcher famous for his holographic brain theory, looking for a level of brain processing maybe down at the level of dendritic micropotentials that could contain the fine details of a visual image. Because macroscopic brain activity, like EEG, doesn't seem isomorphic, doesn't have the same structure as the visual image itself. Grinberg offers a counterpostulate. He suggests the neural field is the immediate antecedent of the image. It doesn't just contain all the details needed for the image. Crucially, it also unifies them, which is a key quality of visual perception. We see a unified scene, not just a collection of disconnected data points.
Okay.
While individual neural codes or activation patterns aren't isomorphic with the image, there must be some immediate energetic antecedent that is capable of becoming isomorphic. Otherwise, how do you explain how brain activity results in a subjective visual experience at all?
So the neural field becomes isomorphic with the image. It takes on the same energetic shape.
The theory posits that the neural field becomes isomorphic, or energetically identical in structure, to the visual image at the moment it interacts with the visual synergic band of the lattice. Neither the band alone nor the field alone is isomorphic with the resulting percept, the image you see.
Right.
But their interference pattern, the complex energetic structure created by their interaction, must be.
Like when two ripples on a pond cross each other and create a new, more complex pattern where they meet.
Exactly. He uses that very analogy. Two concentric waves on a pond. When they interact, they create a complex new geometry, a pattern different from the original simple circles. Something similar, but infinitely more complex and multidimensional, happens between the neural field and the lattice.
Okay.
The resulting interference pattern is 3D, and it possesses synergistic characteristics, qualities of structure, organization, perhaps even subjective feel, that weren't present in either the isolated neural field or the isolated lattice band before they interacted.
And it's that interference pattern that's what we actually perceive as the image, as reality.
Yes. If the image results directly from this interference pattern, then the energetic dimension of the lattice must momentarily take on the exact same form as the image, just before it emerges into our consciousness. This required isomorphism suggests that what we see, what we experience, is the interference pattern activated by our neural field interacting with the lattice.
It gives a whole near, maybe literal meaning to the idea that reality is a projection, or that we live in a simulation generated by our own minds.
It really does. The theory posits it's not just a metaphor to say we live inside a bubble of perception, that we are, in a sense, immersed in our own brain's energetic activity, observing the inner wall of its expansive energetic movement outward into the lattice. This concept strongly echoes ideas found in Carlos Castaneda's work, which Grinberg studied.
Yeah.
And it raises a profound question. Is perception even possible outside this wall? Outside this generated interference pattern?
And what's the theory's answer to that? Are we trapped inside?
According to the theory, the answer lies in the existence of the observer. Remember, neither the lattice, nor the neural field, nor even their interaction in the interference pattern are considered the ultimate level of reality. They're not an inescapable prison for consciousness, because there is something that exists outside their existence, something that perceives them. And this something is the observer. The observer. So the observer is distinct from the entire lattice neural field interaction system that generates our perceived reality. That's the profound implication, yes. And this leads us directly into the discussion of the orbitals of consciousness, those different levels or layers of reality and experience.
Okay.
Consciousness itself, fundamentally, is one. It permeates everything, from the basic, undistorted lattice state, all the way through to all its distortions like matter and fields. Humans, however, through the limitations and focus of our perception, we filter, delimit, and focus this one consciousness into distinct levels. And that's how we experience different realities, different states.
And accessing these different levels is a kind of transformation.
Yes, it's described as a dimensional perceptual transformation. And it's entirely dependent on the observer's focus of perception and, crucially, their identification with a particular territory or level of organization within the overall lattice structure.
So where you identify changes what you perceive?
Exactly. If the observer identifies with the basic lattice structure before any distortions arise, that leads towards the experience of unity consciousness. If the observer identifies primarily with the organic body and its processes, that activates what we call corporeal consciousness, our everyday experience of having a physical body. The observer's access point, their focus and identification, determines their perceptual territory, the reality they inhabit.
So the observer's choice of focus literally changes the reality they experience.
It changes the perceived reality, yes. And here's the really mind-bending implication. The observer seems capable of perceiving and identifying with any and all of the dimensional strata, all the levels of the lattice organization.
Any level.
Yes, which strongly suggests that the observer itself exists in a dimension or reality that somehow includes the entire lattice universe, implying the observer doesn't belong to the lattice universe, but perhaps to another, independent level of reality or universe altogether.
Okay, that really pushes the boundary again. So how do other traditions, other models of consciousness levels fit into this picture? Grinberg looked at several, right?
He did. He examined several different models, viewing them not necessarily as contradictory, but as different approximations, different maps of these potential levels or territories. But they all seem to agree on the core principle. The experience level depends on the observer's perception and identification with a specific territory. Let's look at a few examples detailed in the source.
Okay, let's start with the Kabbalistic model.
Right. Drawing on scholars like Gershom G. Scullin, the Kabbalistic model strongly asserts the fundamental interrelations between all worlds and levels of reality. Everything is connected, the whole is present in each part, and any action on one level affects the entire system.
That sounds very much like the interconnected lattice organization we discussed.
It really does. And Grinberg presents this as being experimentally supported, pointing again to those 1982 and 1987 experiments by Grinberg-Zylberbaum and Ramos, which seem to demonstrate inner brain effects at a distance, supporting this idea of interconnectedness.
Okay, so how does Kabbalah map out these levels?
Kabbalah offers, among others, a longitudinal model. It traces creation from a transcendent, infinite beginning down through successive stages or worlds to our physical reality. It describes 6 primary levels, or worlds, or dimensions.
Jesus levels.
The highest is Ein Sof, literally no end, the infinite, transcendent, unknowable source beyond all manifestation. Below that is Adam Kadmon, the archetypal man, or primordial, unified form associated with the highest soul level called Yekida, which means singularity.
Like the initial blueprint, the unified potential before differentiation.
Exactly. Then comes Atzilut, the world of emanation, the realm of pure archetypes, divine potential, associated with the soul level Jai, meaning living. Below that is Beriah, the world of creation, the realm of pure ideas and archangelic spirits, associated with the soul level Nishama, often translated as Pneuma, or divine breath.
Are these levels considered to exist before the lattice or outside its main structure?
In this specific Kabbalistic model as presented, yes, these higher worlds are seen as preceding or being foundational to the more manifest realms. Then comes Yetzirah, the world of formation, where structures and forms begin to take shape, the angelic realm, associated with the soul-level Ruach, meaning spirit. This is where distortion of the pure unity is said to really begin.
Okay.
And finally, there's Asiya, the world of action, which is our physical world, the realm of manifestation and doing, associated with the soul-level Nefesh, the lower soul or vital life force. Your level of consciousness in this view depends on which soul stratum you primarily identify with, which corresponds to residing perceptually in one of these universes.
And these levels are also represented symbolically, aren't they, with the tetragrammaton?
Yes. The 4 lower worlds, sometimes Adam Kadmon is included implicitly, or sometimes it starts with Atzilut, then Beriah, Yetzirah, Asiya, are associated with the 4 letters of God's ineffable name, YHVH, Yid, He, Vav, Het, He, the tetragrammaton. This name isn't just a name, it's seen as an algorithmic system, a blueprint for creation itself, describing the energetic flow from transcendence down to physical manifestation.
Kabbalah also has the Sephirot, the tree of life diagram. How does that fit in?
That represents a concentric pattern, complementing the longitudinal one. It's the Sephirot scheme, depicting 10 fundamental attributes or qualities or emanations through which the divine Ein Sof manifests and interacts with creation. It's often visualized as the tree of life.
10 attributes.
Yes. A longitudinal model of worlds intertwines with this concentric Sephirot model. Each of the main universes, Atzilut, Beriah, Yetzirah, Asiya, is said to contain within it its own complete set of 10 Sephirot strata, experienced at different levels of subtlety or density appropriate to that world.
And these Sephirot, they have symbolic associations too, like colors.
They do. They have specific names representing qualities, and in some traditions, like that of Rabbi Joseph Tutsto mentioned in the text, they're associated with specific colors used in meditation. Concentrating on the color associated with a sephira is believed to help activate that sephira's quality within your consciousness.
Can you list them? The Sephirot and their colors from the source?
Sure. According to the source's description of Setsto system, from highest most subtle to lowest most manifest, Keter, crown, is associated with white. Jojma, wisdom, with all colors. Bina, understanding, with yellow and green. Cheesed, love or mercy, with white and silver. Kavura, strength or judgment, with red and gold. Tiferet, beauty or compassion, with yellow and purple. Netzach, victory or eternity, with light pink. Hod, splendor or majesty, with dark pink. Yesod, foundation, with orange. And Malshut, kingdom or manifestation, with blue.
So Keter is the highest emanation, closest to Ein Sof, and Malchut is the final manifestation in the physical world.
Exactly. The pattern is both concentric, like layers or spheres, and longitudinal, representing the flow and connections between them. Each universe contains its own 10 Sephirot, its own tree of life structure.
And how does one access these higher Sephirot or worlds?
Kabbalah describes a central luminous source, the Ein Sof light, that illuminates every sephira. How much of that divine light you actually perceive through a particular sephira depends on your internal purity, essentially, the absence of veils or blockages obstructing the light. More purity, fewer veils, means more luminosity is perceived. Kabbalistic techniques are often aimed at purifying these veils, clearing the obstructions through practices like meditation, ethical living, or concentration on the names, attributes, or colors of the Sephirot.
The similarity here to Grinberg's synergistic theory seems really quite striking.
It really is. The Kabbalistic Sephirot and worlds can be seen as analogous to the synergistic band's discrete strata of reality and consciousness. The Ein Sof light that needs to illuminate the Sephirot is analogous to the necessary level of neural field synergy required for congruent interaction with a specific synergic band. The bands exist, sort of waiting, but you need the right internal state, the right neural field synergy, the light, to access and experience them.
And the veils.
The veils obstructing the light in Kabbalah are analogous to the coding errors or obstructions in the brain's neural algorithmization capacity that prevent access to higher, more subtle synergic bands in Grinberg's model. Removing the veils is like correcting the coding errors or increasing neurosynergia.
Fascinating parallel. Okay, what about the Theosophical model? How does that map onto this?
Theosophy, which originated with figures like Madame Blavatsky and was later elaborated by people like Annie Besant and C.W. Leadbeater, offers another model of consciousness levels. This one is based on the idea of different subtle bodies that are associated with different dimensions or planes of existence. It typically posits 7 such bodies or dimensions, each linked to a corresponding level of consciousness.
7 bodies. Okay, what's the first one?
The first is the physical body. That's our familiar organic body, including the brain. It exists in 3D space and is limited by ordinary time and space. In Grinberg's terms, this is seen as a relatively stable distortion of the lattice. Its associated consciousness is our basic 3D waking consciousness of everyday life.
Makes sense. The second body.
The second is the etheric body, sometimes called the vital body or etheric double. This is described as energetic, not physical in the same dense way. It's strongly linked, in Grinberg's interpretation, to the neural field and its interaction with the lattice. Crucially, it's not limited by spatial gravity in the same way the physical body is.
Not limited by gravity.
Right. This body, according to the theory, could potentially explain phenomena like extraocular vision, where trained individuals, like the children Grinberg studied in 1983, can apparently perceive visual information without using their physical eye's retinal receptors. They might be decoding the lattice directly, perhaps via this etheric body faculty.
Interesting.
Etheric dreams are also mentioned, dreams that seem to correspond to stimuli originating in space or the energetic environment, rather than just internal organic activity, like dreaming of flying, which might relate to the etheric body's freedom from physical gravity. Rajneesh is cited as suggesting spiritual visions might be a type of etheric dream. The etheric body is seen as incorporating space more fully within its energetic field, unlike the spatially limited physical body.
Okay, so it's a more energetic, less spatially bound level. What comes next? The third body.
The third is the astral body. This body is said to incorporate both space and time in a more fluid way. It's often associated with experiences like out-of-body travel, accessing the astral plane, and potentially allowing travel to the remote past, perhaps enabling the remembrance of past lives. This might correspond, in psychological terms, to accessing Jung's concept of the collective unconscious.
And from a synergistic perspective.
From a Syntergic viewpoint, you could tentatively link the physical body to the brain itself, the etheric body to the immediate neural field lattice interaction, and the astral body perhaps to interaction with the hyperfields, those collective energetic patterns, but without necessarily transcending them fully yet.
Okay. And the fourth body.
The fourth is the mental body. This corresponds to a level of consciousness that unifies time and space even more profoundly. It incorporates not just the past, but also the personal future into a unified, expanded present moment. This relates back strongly to that idea we discussed earlier about higher consciousness levels expanding the duration of the present. The mental body is still primarily individual, focused on the person's own unified field of experience across time.
Getting more expansive. The fifth.
The fifth is the spiritual body, sometimes called the causal body. This represents a truly transpersonal level of consciousness, transcending the individual ego and even individual hyperfields. It's seen as a body or vehicle of consciousness for the species, or even beyond, where experiences and insights are shared at a level beyond the personal self.
Closer and closer to unity. What's the sixth?
The sixth is the cosmic body, sometimes monadic. This is described as a preamble to full unity consciousness. It transcends the limitations of space, time, individuality, and even the dichotomy between conscious and unconscious. From this level of consciousness, everything in the cosmos is perceived as having consciousness, as being part of one living whole.
And the final, seventh body.
The seventh is the nirvanic body, or Atmic. This level is often described as essentially indescribable using ordinary language or concepts. It's equivalent to unity consciousness in other systems. It represents a complete identity, a fusion or merger between the individual consciousness, perhaps the ultimate refinement of the neural field, and the basic, undistorted lattice structure itself. pure being.
How can we even visualize these different bodies existing?
To offer a possible analogy for how different frequencies or energetic patterns could create distinct structures or bodies in different dimensions, Grinberg mentions the cymatics experiments by Hans Jenny back in 1974. Jenny showed how different sound frequencies could create incredibly complex and stable 2D and 3D patterns in physical media like powders or liquids. This suggests, by analogy, how the various theosophical bodies could perhaps be conceived as stable energetic structures or standing waves existing in different dimensional strata of the lattice, activated by different frequencies or levels of synergy.
That's a fascinating parallel. Okay, let's shift to the shamanic model. You mentioned Mexican shamans were a key source for Grinberg.
Indeed. The shamanic model, drawing heavily from Grinberg's own extensive field work with Mexican shamans, as well as referencing Carlos Castaneda's influential writings, often describes reality as having two fundamental realms. There's the visible world, the everyday reality, sometimes called the tonal. This represents ordinary consciousness, consensus reality. And then there's the invisible world, the nawal, a vast, energetic realm accessible only through seeing, a form of direct perception achieved in non-ordinary states of consciousness.
And different types of shamans access different levels or aspects of this Nahual.
It seems so. For instance, Ogidorami's shamans are mentioned as speaking of three spirits or levels of consciousness they interact with. Granicero's shamans, who work with weather phenomena, apparently perceive and interact with astral beings who defy gravity, beings accessible through contact with these other levels of consciousness. Mediumistic trance is another common shamanic state, involving a temporary shift in personality and accessing knowledge or abilities seemingly far outside the medium's everyday consciousness.
And the lineage described by Castaneda from Don Juan Matus. How did that fit?
That specific lineage posits that human perception arises from the alignment of external and internal emanations, described as luminous energy fields that constitute both the universe and the human being as a luminous energy body. This alignment is modulated by a specific focusing mechanism located on the surface of the luminous body, which Don Juan called the assemblage point.
The assemblage point.
Yes, the specific position where the assemblage point is focused determines which bands of these universal emanations are aligned with our internal ones, thereby creating our perception of a particular reality or world. Different positions of the assemblage point align different bands, leading to the perception of entirely alternative realities. So levels of consciousness or access to different worlds depend directly on the depth and position of the assemblage point.
That sounds, well, incredibly similar to the Syntergic model's core idea of perception arising from the congruent interaction between the neural field and specific lattice bands.
The similarity is quite striking, isn't it? The perceived reality is the result of an interaction or alignment between internal structures, neural field internal emanations, assemblage point focus, and external structures, lattice synergic bands external emanations.
And a key characteristic of shamans often seems to be direct communication.
Yes, that's highlighted. Shamans often exhibit a capacity for direct communication, understanding others, or even aspects of nature, without relying on words. This suggests, in the synergic framework, that their neural field is capable of interacting much more fluidly and directly with the neural fields of others, and perhaps even directly decoding the patterns within the hyperfields. They seem capable of directly perceiving and experiencing these collective and interconnected energetic patterns that most of us are unaware of.
And is there thought to be a general state of shamanic consciousness beyond specific traditions?
Grinberg actually postulates the existence of the shamanic band, a generalized mode or level of shamanic consciousness that incorporates these characteristic abilities like seeing the null, shifting the assemblage point, and direct communication. While specific shamanic models are diverse and often lineage-specific, they share these common underlying characteristics, suggesting this generalized shamanic band of potential human consciousness.
Okay. What about the Buddhist model of consciousness levels?
The Buddhist model, of course, centers on the path to enlightenment, famously exemplified by Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. He started from a life of royal privilege, was confronted by suffering, renounced his status to seek truth, underwent extreme asceticism, and finally achieved enlightenment through deep meditation, triggered, tradition says, by perceiving a star with newfound clarity.
And Buddhism describes many different states of mind, doesn't it?
Oh yes. Buddha is said to have described numerous states and mental conditions. But fundamentally, the core distinction he made was between everyday, unenlightened consciousness and enlightened consciousness.
What's the difference?
Everyday consciousness is characterized by identification with the constant flux of thoughts, emotions, sensations, mistaking these transient phenomena for a solid, permanent self. Enlightened consciousness, on the other hand, transcends these fluctuations. It achieves direct, unmediated contact with reality, often described as the pure self, Buddha nature, or fundamental nature of mind. This brings liberation from suffering, realizing one's true identity not as the fleeting ego, but as reality itself.
Are there different paths or schools within Buddhism that emphasize different aspects?
The source briefly mentions the three main traditional schools or vehicles. Hinayana, the lesser vehicle, focused primarily on individual liberation and often involving monastic withdrawal. Mahayana, the greater vehicle, also seeking individual enlightenment, but emphasizing compassion and prioritizing helping all other beings achieve enlightenment first, seen as more congruent with the idea of unity and universal love. And Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle, prominent in Tibet, which uniquely uses the energy of powerful emotions themselves as fuel for the path to enlightenment.
What are the core Buddhist concepts highlighted in the source that resonate particularly strongly with Grinberg's theory?
Two major concepts stand out. First, the practice of observation, which is central to Vipassana insight schools of meditation. This involves cultivating detached, non-judgmental awareness of whatever arises in experience, bodily sensations, emotions, thoughts, external sights and sounds, simply observing them without getting caught up in them.
Okay.
And second, the concept of sunyata, or emptiness, which we touched upon earlier in relation to the lattice. In Buddhism, sunyata signifies that all phenomena, including the self, lack inherent independent existence. They rise interdependently like reflections in a mirror, empty of any solid, separate reality. This connects very strongly to the Synergistic Theory's idea that objects and experiences arise as modifications or distortions of the fundamental interdependent lattice structure, which itself, in its pure state, is like this sunyata.
Is there a specific Buddhist text mentioned regarding levels?
Yes. The Surangama Sutra is mentioned specifically for its model, describing different strata or levels of consciousness encountered in deep meditation. According to this model, as the meditator progresses, each level attained is initially experienced as the ego, or self of the preceding lower level. But as awareness deepens further, that level itself becomes the content observed by the subsequent higher level.
So the sense of self keeps shifting and dissolving.
Exactly. The fundamental idea here is the progressive realization of the absence of any absolute fixed ego. It's a process of increasingly inclusive observation, where more and more subtle contents of experience are brought into the field of awareness without identification. The source explicitly notes a clear coincidence between this process described in the sutra and the neural algorithmization processes described in the Syntergic Theory, the brain building ever more inclusive higher-level representations of reality.
Okay, let's move to a more modern framework, the transpersonal psychology model.
Right. Transpersonal psychology is a relatively modern field within psychology that explicitly incorporates spiritual, mystical, and transcendent experiences, drawing teachings from various wisdom traditions into a psychological framework. Its main focus is on human development beyond the conventional personal ego, exploring transcendent states of consciousness. The highest level recognized is typically unity consciousness, where the fundamental subject-object distinction dissolves completely.
And how does this model view human fragmentation or psychological suffering?
It often views it as arising from limiting identifications. We identify with specific aspects of ourselves, our thoughts, our roles, or possessions, or with external things, and this creates boundaries and separation. This process involves creating an ego ideal, who we think we should be, and then judging, punishing, or rewarding aspects of ourselves based on that ideal. Aspects we deem negative or unacceptable get repressed into the unconscious, forming the shadow part of the psyche.
The mask versus the shadow.
Exactly. We present a mask or persona to the world, while hiding the shadow aspects we're ashamed of or afraid of. We also tend to project our shadow onto the external world, blaming others or situations for the qualities we deny in ourselves.
So the path towards wholeness and higher consciousness involves integrating these fragmented parts.
Yes, precisely. The initial path to expansion often involved integrating the shadow, acknowledging and accepting those repressed parts, and also integrating the mind with the body, overcoming the mind-body split. Ken Wilber, a prominent figure in transpersonal thought, calls this integrated state the centaur level, where mind and body function as a unified whole. This dissolves the boundary between body and shadow, but there's still a perceived boundary between the self and the other, the self and the world.
How does expansion continue beyond the centaur level?
Further expansion involves identifying with larger and larger territories of reality, incorporating previously external experiences, or even other people, into the felt sense of self. This represents a rapprochement towards unity with others, where the feeling of being a fundamentally separate self begins to dissolve.
Okay.
A higher level described is sometimes called the subtle level, or, using a specific term mentioned in the source, the Son of Man consciousness. This is described as consciousness that is human in the highest, most inclusive sense, capable of accepting and integrating the totality of human experience, joy, suffering, wisdom, folly as part of its own identity. But even here, there might still be a subtle boundary, perhaps between the human and the non-human, or the manifest and the unmanifest.
And the highest levels in this transpersonal view.
Then comes the causal, or cosmic man level, where the individual's identity expands to incorporate the entire cosmos. The sense of self is no longer limited to the personal or even the species level. Finally, the ultimate level is often termed being, pure existence, the ultimate level, or simply unity consciousness. Here, all partial identities cease, all boundaries dissolve, and the one consciousness is realized directly.
And the experience at that level.
At this ultimate level, the theory quotes the transpersonal perspective as saying, every image or percept sees itself. Experience is perceived as that the object, focused on oneself, the subject, and eventually that and oneself merge completely into the one. The journey through the levels is seen as shedding successive layers of limiting identification and blurring the boundaries between self and other, subject and object, until their final complete dissolution in pure being.
Okay, so finally, let's bring all these different models back together and see how Grinberg's own Syntergic model acts as a synthesis, a unifying vision.
Yes, the explicit goal of the Syntergic model is indeed to provide a unifying vision, finding the common ground and underlying mechanisms that could explain the diversity of experiences described in these different traditions. It reiterates its core postulates. Consciousness is fundamentally an attribute of the lattice. Pure consciousness is the basic, undistorted lattice state.
Right.
Levels of consciousness correspond to different types or levels of lattice distortions. Human consciousness, specifically, is associated with the hypercomplex macro distortion generated by brain activity, the neural field interacting with the lattice.
And it incorporates that idea of the image seeing itself.
Yes, it explicitly integrates that idea, which Grinberg attributed as a direct communication to the Vipassana master S.N. Goenka. The image is seen in itself, and the sound is heard in itself. This aligns perfectly with the concept of subject-object dissolution at higher levels of consciousness.
So how does the Syntergic model formally define the levels themselves?
The levels, or orbitals of consciousness, and the distinct sensory qualities associated with them, are seen as arising from the congruent interaction between discrete strata or organizational bands within the lattice, the synergic bands, and analogous discrete levels of neurosynergy within the individual's neural field.
But hold on, didn't we say earlier that the lattice and the neural field might be continuums, not discrete pairs?
Ah, yes, you remembered. That's a potential point of contradiction that the source material itself acknowledges. While the underlying lattice structure and the potential range of neural field states might indeed be continuous, the consistent evidence from subjective experience in different traditions points towards the existence of distinct discrete levels or qualities of consciousness. So, for the purpose of describing these experience levels, the theory assumes a functionally discrete organization for both the synergic bands in the lattice and the corresponding neurothentergic levels in the neural field.
Okay, so it's a functional discreteness, even if the underlying reality might be continuous.
That seems to be the working assumption. Each distinct level of consciousness, or each specific sensory quality, like vision or hearing, is therefore the result of a congruent interaction between a specific syntergic band, a particular organization of the lattice, and a neural field possessing an analogous level of neurosynergy. Analogous here means having the right level of information density, the right pattern of neuronal interactions, the corresponding processing time, and the associated duration of the present moment.
And this model also incorporates the holographic idea, the whole and the part.
Yes. Just as each point in the lattice is theorized to contain the information of the whole universe, the Syntergic model suggests that each experience, no matter how seemingly limited, is in some sense an experience of the whole totality. Our lack of understanding, our feeling of limitation, depends entirely on our current level of consciousness and where our identification is focused. It's difficult to experience a visual image as seeing itself if you are firmly identified with a concrete ego that perceives itself as separate from the objects it sees out there, which is the default state reinforced by common sense.
So each level of consciousness, each synergic band we access, is also a different way of experiencing time and space.
Absolutely. The process of temporal unification, bringing events from different temporal orders into an expanded present moment, is seen as a key indicator of higher consciousness levels. This unification is interpreted as a transformation of space into time, or perhaps more accurately, as a progressive penetration into the four-dimensionality of the space-time continuum described by physics.
Okay.
Each level of consciousness, each distinct sensory quality, is therefore described as representing a different stratum or level of penetration into this underlying 4D universe. The ultimate limit of this expansion, the highest possible level, is the direct experience of the pure 4D lattice in a state of pure consciousness, transcending conventional notions of space and time altogether.
So to conclude this section on the orbitals of consciousness,
These orbitals are the various levels or states that the one consciousness can assume, ranging from the most concrete, fragmented, ego-identified state all the way up to absolute unity consciousness. At the higher levels, dichotomies like subject-object, inner-outer dissolve. The image sees itself, the sound hears itself, and crucially, the ability to access and stably experience these different levels, these different orbitals, depends directly on the synergy level of your individual neural field, which is influenced by your state of consciousness, your practices, your level of development.
now here's a puzzle. Even if the neural field and the collective hyperfields are everywhere in the lattice, permeating all of space, our actual moment-to-moment perception feels intensely localized. How do we focus our attention? Why don't we perceive everything everywhere all at once?
That's an excellent question, and it brings us to what the theory calls the directionality factor.
Yeah.
You're right, the neural field and hyperfields are ubiquitous. Since any lattice distortion affects all points, the neural field, being a hyper-complex distortion, must also be incorporated into the lattice structure at all locations.
So my personal neural field pattern is, in some sense, present everywhere in space.
According to the logic of the theory, yes. But the paradox is, as you say, that experience, while potentially ubiquitous in the lattice, is perceived by us as being intensely localized. Where exactly is the experience located? The sources discuss three main possibilities based on different perspectives or states. One, located in the neural field itself, giving the sense the experience is in body within our personal energy field. Two, located at the edge of the interaction between the neural field and the lattice, feeling like the experience is within the perceived object or event itself. Three, located purely in the lattice itself, which could allow for perception seemingly independent of the body, like out-of-body experiences.
Are there examples of this third kind, perception located outside the body?
Yes. Mexican shamanism provides several examples. Doña Pachita, the famous healer Grinberg studied extensively, was reputed to be able to place her perception consciously outside her physical body in different locations, even while performing complex healing procedures.
Wow. But even in totally normal, everyday life, we're constantly focusing, aren't we? We're not perceiving everything.
Exactly. Remember that idea from Kabbalah via Moises Cordovero? Wherever you are, there all the worlds meet. A single point in the lattice theoretically contains information about the entire universe. Yet when you stand somewhere and look at a landscape, you decode the information making up the landscape. You could theoretically decode information about moon craters or distant galaxies or subatomic particles, all converging at that same point in space, but you don't. You focus.
So there must be a focusing mechanism.
There must be. And this is what the theory terms the directionality factor. It's the mechanism that focuses our perception onto a specific interference pattern, a specific synergic band interaction.
And this factor works internally, too, focusing on different levels of brain activity?
Yes, it's believed to act intracorporeally as well. It's what brings specific levels of brain activity into the field of conscious awareness. Typically, in everyday consciousness, we're only aware of the final result of cortical processing, the unified percept, the final interference pattern. We don't consciously perceive the raw signals from the retina or the intermediate processing steps in the thalamus.
But maybe we could.
With training, yes. Practices like self-elusive meditation are specifically designed, in part, to allow one to learn to focus attention on and become aware of these intermediate levels of internal processing, the arising of sensations, thoughts, emotions, before they coalesce into the final story.
So the directionality factor determines what we focus on, both in the external world and within our own internal processes.
Yes. It determines the focus of perception, both external and internal to the organic body. The theory suggests that the interaction creating potential interference patterns is happening constantly, at all accessible levels and strata of the lattice neural field interaction simultaneously. But usually, only one resulting interference pattern is consciously perceived at any given moment. The directionality factor is what selects which one comes into focus.
Is there another name for this mechanism?
Interestingly, the Mexican shamanic tradition, particularly the lineage associated with Don Juan Matus, apparently calls this focusing mechanism the lace point, or assemblage point, as noted in Grinberg's Volume 6 of the Shamans of Mexico. It performs a similar function of selecting which reality or level of perception is activated.
Okay, but how does this directionality factor actually work? What controls the focus?
The theory explores two main possible explanations for its functioning. Possibility 1. Conscious focus could simply be a natural emergent outcome of the neural field's overall neurosynthetic level. The focus just happens automatically because of the degree of congruence or resonance between the current state of the neural field and specific lattice bands at certain synergy levels. Stronger congruence naturally draws focus. This explanation wouldn't require any kind of external controller.
Makes sense. What's the second possibility?
The second possibility is that focusing perception requires an external focusing mechanism, something independent of the lattice and the neural field itself, but capable of modifying the lattice or directing the interaction between the field and the lattice. This would necessarily imply the existence of a reality or dimension that exists independently of, or perhaps senior to, the lattice universe itself.
Which explanation does the Kabbalistic model seem to support?
The Kabbalistic model, as interpreted in the source, strongly supports the second option, the external controller. Remember the worlds. Distortion and formation begin down in Yetzirah formation and manifest fully in Asura action. But prior, more subtle universes and associated soul levels, like Pariyanashama, Atsaluchai, Adam Kadmon Yechida, even Ein Sof, exist before these manifest worlds and are considered superior to Ruach, spirit, and the levels below it.
Okay.
According to this Kabbalistic framework, the focus of perception, the control of attention, the directionality factor, it's ultimately a transcendent matter. It's controlled or directed from outside the manifest lattice-based universe, originating from these higher, more causal realms.
And for most of us living identified with the physical world, that transcendent origin goes completely unnoticed.
Completely. Since most humans are primarily identified with the products of the lattice and its distortions, the physical world, the body, the ego, corresponding roughly to the nefesh and lower ruach levels in Kabbalah, this transcendent origin of the attentional command, the focusing power, goes unrecognized.
Who does recognize it?
Only those individuals whose consciousness perceives or identifies with levels prior to the manifest lattice, those who are situated perhaps at a soul level higher than ruach, spirit, would recognize that the focus of attention is always, fundamentally, a transcendent matter, originating from a dimension beyond the universe they're perceiving.
So this frames humans not just as brains in bodies, but as instruments.
Yes. Instruments of a much more expanded reality, with that reality flowing through us. Our perceived structure, our experience, depends on our specific physical and mental makeup, which determines how we interact with that flow. This aligns perfectly with the core Synergistic Theory postulate. Perception arises from the interaction between the individual neural field and the universal synergic bands, with these bands representing available levels of consciousness and the directionality factor guiding which interaction comes into focus.
Okay, so our consciousness levels are tied to interacting with these synergic bands, guided by a directionality factor, which might even originate outside the whole system. Where does individuality fit into this picture? If it's all ultimately one lattice, one consciousness, are we just temporary eddies destined to dissolve?
That's a fundamental question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The path towards unity consciousness, as described within the Synergistic Theory, involves the simultaneous incorporation of an ever-increasing number of experiences until the observer and the contents of observation merge into one. Grinberg calls this process expanded neuroalgorithmization.
Like integrating absolutely everything into a single massive insight or state of being.
Exactly. It's compared explicitly to how highly inclusive polysensory neural algorithms function in the brain. They integrate vast amounts of information from multiple senses into a powerful unified pattern, which is essential for creating a coherent sense of self or ego. Now imagine taking that process to its absolute extreme. At the extreme end of this expansion, the totality of included information becomes practically indistinguishable from the lattice itself. The subject-object distinction completely dissolves. The observer and the observed contents merge seamlessly into one unity consciousness.
How does this compare to concepts like Samadhi in yoga or ascending the tree of life in Kabbalah? Do they point to the same endpoint?
The source draws direct comparisons. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras describes samyama, the combined practice of concentration, meditation, and absorption on an object until complete merger samadhi occurs. The traditional yogic path involves performing samadhi on progressively subtle objects, culminating in samadhi on the true self, which leads to liberation or unity.
Okay.
Similarly, in Kabbalah, the ascent through the soul levels, from the gross nefesh up towards the subtle yekida, and their associated universes, from Asia up towards Ein Sof, is also framed as a process of observing and identifying with increasingly subtle objects or levels of reality. It's an ascent from the gross to the subtle, from the many to the one.
So Grinberg sees these different paths, the inclusive observation path and the subtle ascent path, as ultimately leading to the same place.
Yes, he synthesizes them. He suggests that both paths, the Shamanic or Synergic path, emphasizing simultaneous inclusive observation for unity, and the Yogic or Kabbalistic path, emphasizing a step-by-step ascent from gross to subtle, ultimately converge on the same realization of unity consciousness. Both involve incorporating increasing elements of reality into the self, and both involve increasing the level of abstraction or subtlety being perceived. This synthesis highlights a key correlation. High-power neuroalgorithmic synthesis in the brain corresponds directly to the capacity to perceive increasingly subtle reality.
And that high-power neural algorithmization links back directly to the neural field synergy level.
Precisely. High-power neuroalgorithm synthesis is seen as equivalent to activating a high neurosynergy neural field, and that, in turn, is what allows for congruent interaction with a high-coherence, high-density, high-frequency syntergic band, which is the domain where subtle information, subtle reality resides.
So this framework offers a potential mechanism for explaining paranormal perception or interbrain communication.
Potentially, yes. It provides a theoretical basis for understanding the perceptual capacity for subtle information, which Grinberg felt was supported by his own lab's experiments, apparently demonstrating interbrain communication at a distance, suggesting information exchange occurring beyond the known sensory channels, perhaps via interaction at these subtle synergic band levels.
So back to the core question. Where does individuality fit in this expanding merging process? Does it just disappear?
Here's the crucial point, according to the theory. Individuality isn't seen as a fixed, separate entity that gets dissolved or annihilated in unity. Instead, it's redefined. Individuality is seen as depending on the specific capacity an individual consciousness has developed to receive, process, and interact with the subtle aspects of information contained within the various synergic bands.
So your unique abilities define your individuality.
Your unique perceptual and interactive capacity, yes. And crucially, the theory asserts that this individuality keeps expanding rather than disappearing, even as one approaches and enters unity consciousness. The understanding of the self is radically transformed. You realize you are not separate, but the unique perspective, the unique node of consciousness, isn't lost. It expands to incorporate the totality. Unity consciousness is described as direct contact with pure existence, an experience that inherently surpasses any attempt at theoretical explanation.
And are we just passive receivers of these bands, or do we play a more active role?
Not passive at all. The theory strongly asserts that individuality is not just receptive. Humans are not merely receivers of existing synergic bands. We're also active creators of new synergic bands.
We create levels of consciousness. How?
Evolved humans, individuals who achieve higher, more stable states of consciousness, who pioneer new ways of perceiving or being, actually create and bequeath these new synergic bands, these new potential states of consciousness or ways of interacting with reality to the species as a whole. They become available possibilities for others.
How can someone else then access or recreate these bands that were created by others in the past?
Techniques exist, often embedded within spiritual traditions, that seem designed precisely for this purpose, to help individuals recreate these specific consciousness states or access these bands. The source gives two examples. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, visualizing the intricate details of deities depicted in tankas, complex symbolic paintings, is a practice. This intense visualization is believed to activate a specific brain state and neural field morphology in the practitioner.
Right.
Which then allows for congruent interaction with the synergic band associated with that particular deity's level of consciousness or specific quality, like compassion or wisdom. Similarly, in Kabbalah, the practice of visualizing the Hebrew names or geometric arrangements of the Sephirot is used as a technique to activate the corresponding states of consciousness, presumably by generating the appropriate neural field patterns needed for interaction with those specific bands or levels of the tree of life.
Okay, so contrasting this with everyday consciousness, our normal state is quite limited then.
Yeah, very much so. Our daily waking reality is fundamentally filtered, colored, and limited by our habitual identification with our mind. Thoughts, beliefs, concepts, our emotions, our bodily sensations, our vitality. What we perceive isn't raw reality. It's reality strained through these filters.
And the shift towards self-consciousness, what does that involve?
That represents a major perceptual leap, a fundamental shift in identification. It's the state where you begin to witness the mind, the body, the emotions from a detached observation point rather than being completely fused with them. In this state, reality starts to be perceived more directly, less filtered by those habitual identifications. The self is experienced as something that transcends the constantly changing conditions of the mind and body.
The observer becomes active.
Yes. The observer is activated as a stable identity, neutral, and witnessing the fluctuations without being swept away by them. This state corresponds, in brain terms, to the activation of a highly powerful, coherent neuroalgorithmic state.
And the next level beyond that, witnessing self-consciousness.
That's the transition into unity consciousness, where the observer as a separate, witnessing entity disappears or dissolves. The final subject-object distinction collapses. So individuality exists at the everyday level, it exists at the self-consciousness observer level, and it even exists in a transformed way at the unity level, but it expands radically at each step. The understanding of selves is fundamentally transformed. As mentioned, unity consciousness is direct contact with pure existence, an experience beyond theory.
This theory is just so vast, covering physics, consciousness, mysticism, brain function. It seems like it must have some incredible practical repercussions or applications if it's even partly true.
It absolutely does. And Grinberg himself derived several direct applications and potential consciousness technologies directly from this theoretical framework.
Okay, let's talk about those. What are some examples?
One key application is self-illusion meditation. This is presented as a specific consciousness technology, a practice designed to activate self-awareness, that observer state, and facilitate the movement towards unity consciousness. It's based precisely on that principle of detached, simultaneous observation of multiple areas of experience, tracking bodily sensations, thoughts as they arise and pass, emotions and input from the external environment all at the same time, without judgment or identification.
Okay, simultaneous observation. What about influencing the collective reality, the hyperfield?
That leads to the concept of the psychophysiology of power. This is described as another potential consciousness technology, this one aimed at positively influencing the collective hyperfields, those shared energetic structures.
How would that work?
It's based on two main ideas. First, the notion of a collective directionality factor, the shared focus of collective attention within a group or society, which might be modifiable by individuals with sufficiently high consciousness capacity, high neurosynergia. And second, the potential for making contact with a strange attractor that represents the ideal future or inherent evolutionary direction of the hyperfield itself.
A strange attractor pulling evolution towards a goal, like a cosmic purpose.
Exactly. The hyperfield isn't seen as just a random collection of energies. It's proposed to have an inherent evolutionary direction, a pull towards greater complexity in consciousness. And this pull is conceptualized as a strange attractor. The theory explicitly equates this idea to Teilhard de Chardin's concept of the omega point, that ultimate convergent goal of cosmic evolution.
And how do you make contact with this attractor, this omega point?
Contact is said to be achieved by significantly increasing one's individual neurosynergia, raising the coherence and frequency of the neural field, often through practices like self-elusive meditation, and by expanding the subjective duration of the present moment. Experientially, this contact is described as a state of intense ecstasy, bliss, or beatitude. It's equated with the state of grace described in Christian mysticism.
So psychophysiology of power is about leadership of consciousness.
Essentially, yes. The ability to achieve high neurosynergia, potentially contact the omega point, and thereby positively influence the collective hyperfield towards its evolutionary potential. It's framed as the psychophysiology of true consciousness leadership.
Okay, that's already pretty profound. Are there even more, say, physically radical, practical implications discussed, like affecting physics directly?
Perhaps the most startling and potentially transformative practical implication mentioned relates to the possibility of modifying gravity and the curvature of space directly through consciousness.
Modifying gravity? Seriously?
Yes. A 1982 experiment by Grinberg-Zylberbaum's lab is cited, which reportedly showed that measurable changes in a subject's inner hemispheric coherence, a measure of neurosynergia, were correlated with detectable oscillations in gravity measured by sensitive instruments placed near the subject.
Changes in brain coherence affected gravity measurements nearby.
That was the reported finding and the conclusion drawn, that modifications in the neural field's neurosynergy can directly affect the surrounding lattice synergy in a way that manifests as changes in the gravitational field.
If that were true, the implications are just
Immense.
immense. Transportation, levitation, potentially a gravity drive for spacecraft.
Yeah.
It opens up science fiction possibilities.
Is there any kind of analogy offered for how that might even work? The analogy used in the text is thinking of the lattice as a kind of superconductor. Increasing the brain's coherence to a very high level of neurosynergia could, theoretically, produce an action similar to the Meissner effect in physics, where a magnetic field is expelled from a superconductor, allowing a magnet to levitate above it. This analogy is drawn from concepts described in standard physics texts like Beiser's Concepts of Modern Physics, applied here in a novel way.
Okay. Mind-bending. What about communication? Any applications there?
Communication is another major area. A 1988 experiment from Grinberg's lab titled Creation of Experience is cited for discovering what they termed the transferred potential.
The transferred potential, what is that?
The experiment apparently involved pairs of subjects who first engaged in some form of nonverbal empathic communication or connection. Then they were separated, placed in isolated electromagnetically shielded chambers, Faraday cages. When one subject was stimulated, for example with light flashes or sounds, a distinct electrical potential, a measurable brain signal was detected in the brain of the other, unstimulated subject, even though there were absolutely no known sensory signals connecting them.
So, direct brain-to-brain information exchange without any physical signal.
That's how it was interpreted. Direct, non-local information transfer between brains. The potential practical use is obvious. Transmitting information without relying on any electronic devices, potentially enabling communication across vast distances.
Did they test the speed?
They were reportedly about to test the transmission speed when Grinberg disappeared. The prediction, based on the theory's implications of lattice interconnectedness, was that the transmission would be instantaneous faster than light, meaning communication could occur without any time delays, regardless of distance.
Instantaneous communication. Okay. Could the lattice itself be used for, like, computing?
That's another speculative application discussed. The lattice computer.
Yeah.
Given the theory's premise that the lattice has colossal information storage capacity, with information from the entire universe theoretically accessible at each point, the idea arose of using the fundamental structure of the lattice itself as a computing medium.
How would that work?
The concept involves somehow learning to encode information into the lattice structure and then using its inherent processing capabilities to perform analysis and computation. It even raises the possibility of inventing a lattice computer that mimics the structure and function of the human brain, perhaps capable of creating and harnessing a neural field-like energy fields for computation.
And finally, what about energy? Can we tap into the lattice for power?
That's the ultimate potential application mentioned, harnessing lattice energy. If the lattice truly has virtually infinite energy capacity condensed at each point, could we learn to tap into it? The specific idea discussed is activating specific energy patterns or shapes within the lattice to directly materialize objects, or even biological structures like organs.
Serialization, like creating things out of thin air.
Essentially, yes. The potential uses are staggering. Satisfying basic material needs for everyone, or revolutionizing medical practice by, for instance, materializing perfectly healthy replacement organs directly within a patient's body.
Has this been tested at all?
The source asserts that this has been tested in practice, at least anecdotally or in preliminary ways. It points again to the materialization phenomena reportedly demonstrated by the healer Doña Pachita, as documented in Grinberg's Shamans of Mexico, Volume 3. It also references the possibility of restoring vision to the blind via direct decoding of the lattice, bypassing the eyes, citing Grinberg's 1985 work on extraocular vision as evidence for the brain's ability to interact directly with the lattice for perception.
Okay, so trying to summarize this absolutely incredible, sprawling journey through Jacobo Grinberg-Zylberbaum's Synergistic Theory, what's the single central theme that really ties it all together?
If you had to boil it down, the secret, according to the theory, lies fundamentally in unification processes.
Unification. Can you give us one last analogy to grasp that?
Think about the consciousness of a single cell within your body. That cell is constantly influenced by the state of the entire body, right? Hormones, nerve signals, nutrient levels. The totality of the body is, in a way, inaccessible to the cell itself in its entirety. It can't know the whole body directly. but that totality is somehow algorithmically represented within the cell's functioning, in its DNA, in its responses. It follows a kind of holographic principle. The whole is reflected or represented in the part.
Okay.
Human consciousness is seen in a very similar light. We are constantly influenced by an inaccessible totality, the pure lattice, the collective hyperfield, maybe even realms beyond. Yet this totality is also algorithmically represented within each individual consciousness through our brain structure and our neural field.
And the brain's own dynamics reflect this.
Yes, the two key brain processes mirror this duality. Neural algorithmization is the process of convergence, representing the unity, the whole, within the individual elements, the neurons, creating internal models. Neural field activation is about accessing the hyperfield the energetic unity that exists outside the individual cellular structure, connecting us to the collective and the lattice. Both are deemed necessary for conscious perception. A percept needs the neural field to distort the lattice and actually be created energetically, but it also needs to be neural algorithmized by the brain's processing networks to be identified, understood, and experienced coherently.
And there's that reciprocal influence too, right? My individual brain activity affects the larger whole.
Yes, absolutely. The element affects the unit. A neural algorithmic modification within your brain alters your personal neural field, and that altered neural field, in turn, affects the collective hyperfield. Now, that influence likely dilutes as the unit expands a change. Altering your personal neural field might have a less powerful effect on the vast hyperfield than a major change at the hyperfield level, like a global event, might have on your individual neural field. But the connection works both ways.
Which sounds very much like those mystical ideas about humans being able to influence higher spiritual realms through prayer or intention.
Exactly. The source mentions Moshe Luzzato's The Way of God, a classic Kabbalistic text, which describes precisely this two-way interaction. How spiritual forces emanating from oneness affect human consciousness, and conversely, how individual human consciousness, through thoughts, actions, and intentions, can influence the state of those higher spiritual realms. The synergistic model, with its interconnected lattice and the influence of individual and collective neural fields, provides a potential scientific or perhaps proto-scientific framework for understanding how such interactions might actually occur.
Okay. To wrap up this incredibly deep dive, let's touch briefly on Grinberg's reflections, specifically on time. The sources acknowledge this is a particularly complex and puzzling area.
Indeed. Time is notoriously slippery. We all experience time subjectively, right? Its perceived passage seems to speed up when we're engaged in having fun and slow to a crawl when we're bored, anxious, or in pain. Our psychological state dramatically alters our felt sense of time.
And objectively, physics, especially Einstein's relativity, tells us time isn't absolute either.
Right. Einstein showed definitively that the passage of time is relative to the observer's frame of reference, specifically their speed. As a traveler approaches the speed of light, their clock slows down relative to a stationary observer. At the theoretical limit of light speed, time passage would effectively stop altogether. The famous Ken paradox is the classic thought experiment illustrating this objective relativity. Time doesn't tick by at the same rate for everyone, everywhere.
So if time doesn't have an absolute speed of passage, subjectively or objectively, does time even exist at all in a fundamental sense?
That's the deep question. Just denying its existence seems problematic because it seems to contradict the obvious temporal directionality we observe in physical events. An ink drop always diffuses outwards in water, never spontaneously reassembles itself. Entropy increases. This implies some kind of real, even if non-objective, arrow or directionality to temporal processes.
But there are counter-ideas from physics and mysticism, too.
There are. Physics has concepts like hypothetical tachons, particles that could travel faster than light and potentially move backwards in time, from future to past. Quantum mechanics has phenomena like entanglement, suggesting instantaneous interactions at a distance, where time seems to disappear objectively as a limiting factor. And, of course, numerous mystical traditions describe states of consciousness characterized by subjective timelessness, experiencing an absolute eternal present where the sense of time passing completely ceases.
So how does Grinberg's lattice model attempt to reconcile these vastly different conceptions of time?
The theory proposes a potential reconciliation by linking time directly to the state of the lattice. It postulates that the basic, undistorted lattice state, the state of maximum synergy, perfect symmetry, and coherence, is fundamentally timeless. Yes. In this view, a sufficiently syntergic neural field, one that achieves high coherence, and doesn't create significant distortions in the lattice, would allow the individual to experience this mystical timelessness, a state of pure, unified, coherent present moment, because they are congruently interacting with the timeless aspect of the lattice.
And what about the speed of light limit?
The timelessness experienced mathematically at the speed of light, where time dilation becomes infinite, could correspond to this basic, immobile, timeless state of the lattice itself. Light speed is perhaps the ultimate speed limit because it represents interaction with this immobile, timeless reference frame. Everything else, anything that moves or changes relative to this fundamental state, experiences passing time. The very constancy of the speed of light, regardless of the observer's motion, might support this idea of an underlying immobile reference, the pure lattice. With respect to this immobile reference, time passes, and that perception of passage is what we call time.
So differences in how we experience time passage, like the different durations of the present for sight versus sound, are linked to our perceptual functioning, our interaction with the lattice.
Yes. Those differences, the fact that different qualities of experience seem to have different inherent durations of the present, which are tied to neural field synergy levels, are seen as direct effects of our perceptual functioning as it interacts with and modifies the lattice.
And what about the fleeting, ephemeral nature of reality as we normally perceive it? Images and sounds constantly changing.
The theory views the lattice distortions created by our brain function as being inherently ephemeral. A specific visual image exists as a distinct interference pattern for only about 50 milliseconds. Then it disappears. It's merged with subsequent slightly different patterns by our brain's neuroalgorithmic processing, that reality glue, to create the illusion of a smooth, continuous visual stream. Sounds are merged similarly over their shorter processing window.
But could we make those distortions permanent? Could we materialize things?
Here's a fascinating speculative thought experiment raised in the source. What if you could learn to consciously expand the duration of a visual percept generated by your brain function? What if you could hold that specific lattice distortion pattern stable for longer than its usual fleeting moment?
Yeah.
The theory hypothesizes that this could lead to the actual materialization of objects created directly by brain function. By fixing those lattice distortions, making them persist, you could potentially create longer-lasting, perhaps even tangible forms. Pachita's reported materializations are again offered as potential, albeit controversial, empirical support for this very possibility. Perhaps the permanence of any material object ultimately depends on the stability and relationship, the distance, maybe, between the distorted elements in the specific lattice pattern that constitutes it.
So understanding time, how it arises from lattice distortion, is key to understanding reality creation itself.
Fundamentally, yes. Understanding time is seen as crucial because the ability to create different levels of reality, from fleeting thoughts to seemingly solid objects, seems intrinsically linked to handling time, to managing the duration and stability of lattice distortions. Why are solid objects hard and permanent, while clouds are ephemeral? Physics explains this based on atomic structure and interatomic forces. But if gas, liquid, and solid are all ultimately different types of lattice distortions, why does this structural difference lead to such vastly different permanence? Does the permanence of a fleeting mental fantasy depend on the structural relationships, the distance between the distorted elements, and the lattice pattern it momentarily creates? The materialization evidence, however anecdotal, is presented as suggesting these questions are potentially empirical, not just philosophical.
So something about the neural field's pattern and its interaction must hold the key.
Something in the neural field's morphology, its frequency, its coherence, and how it interacts with the lattice must be key not only to understanding the subjective qualities of perception, light, sound, etc., but also to understanding the permanence of perceived forms, why a rock endures while a dream image dissipates.
And time seems to exist primarily where the lattice is distorted, away from its pure state.
That's the final conclusion drawn from the theory regarding time. Time appears to exist wherever and whenever the lattice is distorted or modified from its basic, timeless, perfectly coherent state. This strongly suggests that time itself could be fundamentally the result of any change, any modification, any departure from symmetry in the basic lattice structure.
Including gravity.
Yes. Gravitational fields, which physics describes as alterations or curvatures of space-time, and which this theory sees as lattice alterations curvatures, are known to affect the passage of time.
So the brain creates time.
Since the neural field actively modifies and distorts the lattice through its complex, ever-changing activity, the brain structure and functioning are seen, in this framework, as literal creators of time. Human consciousness, by generating the neural field and its patterns of distortion, actively modifies the underlying timeless state of the lattice, imbuing it with the experience of temporal passage. In a very real sense, perhaps time is primarily a human creation, or more broadly, a consciousness-based creation arising from interaction with the timeless substrate.
That don't elementary particles and chairs and planets also distort the lattice?
They absolutely do. And therefore, their distortions must also affect time, according to the theory. Time isn't just a product of biology. And philosophically, speaking of time necessarily implies the existence of non-time, just as speaking of being implies non-being, or light implies darkness. You can't fully define something without implicit reference to its opposite. The lattice model, as presented by Grinberg, neatly satisfies this conceptual need. It provides for timelessness in the basic, undistorted lattice, and for time in the distorted lattice. Both brain activity and its energetic product, the neural field, and inanimate matter distort the lattice, and thus both are seen in their own ways as creating or manifesting time within the timeless whole.
And there you have it, an absolutely incredible, truly deep dive into the vast scope, the intricate details, and the profound implications of Jacobo Grinberg-Zylberbaum's Synergistic Theory, all pulled directly from your source material.
We've journeyed through his radical ideas about the fundamental structure of space as the lattice, the nature of consciousness as an attribute of that lattice, the brain as an evolved model of reality, and how the dynamic interaction between the brain's neural field and the lattice's synergic bands gives rise to the entire world we perceive. And we really tried to leave no detail from the sources untouched to really grasp the full dimensions of his research.
Hopefully, this deep dive has given you not just information, but some powerful nuggets of knowledge, maybe some significant aha moments. Hopefully, it helps you cut through the usual information overload and provides a thorough yet digestible understanding of this incredibly complex and ambitious framework.
And just to leave you with a final thought to ponder, something to maybe sit with after this. If consciousness is truly a fundamental attribute of the very fabric of space itself, of this basic lattice, and if our brains are these intricate instruments constantly shaping and distorting that space through their energetic interaction, what responsibility then do we actually have for the reality we are collectively creating, moment by moment, with every thought, every feeling, every interaction?
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Keep exploring these extraordinary ideas.